With the help of an endowment, the Anne Newman Southern Weeks Poetry Series invites poets and prose writers to Westminster for an afternoon of literary reading and conversation about writing, identity, culture, and craft. Today's event features author Tope Folarin. Tope's novel, A Particular Kind of Blackland, was published by Simon & Schuster in 2019. It won the Whiting Award, and Publishers Weekly described it as, quote, a canny and electrifying novel about a Nigerian family living in Utah and their uneasy assimilation to American life, end quote. The story's protagonist, Tunde, grapples with a constellation of identities as he searches for meaning in a world filled with painful truths, haunting memories, and unyielding hope. I read the novel in one sitting, and I have to say, Tope Folarin really knows how to keep the story vulnerable, gripping, and so tense that I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about the characters. And I had a tough time going back to sleep, but in a good way. Tope's essays and criticism have also appeared in numerous publications and media, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, New York Times, BBC, and The Atlantic. He serves as director of the Institute for Public Policy and is the Lonan Visiting Lecturer of Creative Writing at Georgetown University. He is a recipient of the King Prize for African Writing, the Whiting Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. On behalf of Westminster University and the Poetry Series, I am so pleased and honored to welcome Tope Folarin.
It is so wonderful to be here today for a number of reasons. First of all, I've had the great pleasure of reading this book in a bunch of places, but it's meaningful to be back in Utah, where I was born, where I spent the first 13 years of my life. This is incredible for me. It just so happens also that it's my birthday today. So. It's really fantastic to be back in Utah on the day of my birth. And so I've spent the day kind of thinking about that coincidence, which maybe isn't a coincidence. It's really wonderful to be here. I want to talk a little bit about the process of writing this book and becoming an artist before reading just a bit. Because the process of writing and creating this book is intimately tied to my development as a human being and also this book as well. As you may have gleaned from the introduction, I was born in Utah in the 80s, and my parents are from Nigeria. My dad came here because he wanted an education. He wanted a chance at the American dream. My dad didn't know much at all about America before he came here. He actually spent a year in Los Angeles and then moved here because one of his close friends was a student at Weber State University, and his friend said, they have a great international program, you'd have a good time there. And my dad just signed up for it not knowing what he was getting into, and he came here. Turns out that he liked it a lot. He went back to Nigeria, married my mother, and they came here. And so I grew up thinking that the entire world was like Utah, basically, and didn't have a sense of what was really happening elsewhere. This was partly because I spent a lot of my formative years in Bountiful, Utah, Ogden at Bountiful. I started going to school in Bountiful. And my parents were very religious, not Mormon, but super religious. And obviously, like everyone around us was quite religious. And so I didn't really have a full sense of like what reality was like beyond this Utah context. And that was good and perhaps not so good in many ways. The one question I'm constantly asked whenever I'm somewhere else is, how was it to grow up in Utah? Sometimes they whisper it. And the one thing that I would say is that I had, for all intents and purposes, a really great childhood. I always talk about the kindness of people who live here, which a lot of people don't know about. You know, the thing is, like, obviously there were sort of, I guess you could say, political differences between my parents and the rest of our neighborhood. My parents might have voted a different way than our neighbors did. But everyone in our community took seriously the idea that there's an immigrant family here and we're going to chip in to the extent that we can. And I benefited so much from that. I remember vividly during, this book starts with a crisis moment in my life, and I'm quite honest about what happened is that my mother became sick. She had a kind of mental break. And a lot of things happened after that. She took my brother and me away from our home. We lived at the YWCA for about a year. My mother managed to convince them that my dad was doing things that he actually wasn't doing. It was a crazy moment. That culminated in my mom going back to Nigeria and my dad becoming a single parent. So he was a single parent in Bountiful. And I remember vividly, I'll never forget this. I'm in the first grade at this point, and my teacher her name was Mrs. Abel. And Mrs. Abel just took a great interest in me. She would always keep me after class and sort of ask how I was doing. She used to come by on Saturdays and Sundays. On Saturdays, she'd take me to the museum. She would drop out books. She would drop out all kinds of things. This kind of thing continued throughout my life. I also was a big basketball person. I loved the Utah Jazz and still do. Was crushed by the 90s defeat to the Chicago Bulls, but I won't talk about that. And I remember doing junior jazz basketball program, and my best friend at the time, his father would always come by the house to pick me up. He would always pay for my meals, never mentioned it. And so that's what I retained or I experienced in Utah, is kind of generosity and kindness of people who were here and who kind of looked after us. Now, there were other things that happened, of course. There were instances of racism and unfortunate sort of incidents along like that. But for the most part, people were genuinely kind and amazing. One of the reasons I'm standing here before you is that my dad, during that moment, he was a single father for about 3 or 4 years. And he worked relentlessly. He would get up at 7. He would often come home at 7 or 8. He was working 2, 3 jobs. I've never known someone who worked as hard as he did. And his work ethic is something I still deeply admire to this day. And he worked 7 days a week. So on the weekend, we couldn't afford a babysitter, and he would drop us off at the Ogden library. And so I was basically raised by the library. I remember my dad, who was a very strict person. Every time he dropped us off at the library, he would say, make sure they read only books about presidents and heads of state. And then he would leave. And then I'd go to the librarian and say, I want to read the latest sci-fi book. And he said, come over here. So I formed genuine friendships with these librarians. It became an incredibly important experience for me because I was struggling with all kinds of things, like with my identity, the sense of the world and my place in the world. And books, and this is hokey, but it's true, books became my escape. And I read like crazy. There was a show that premiered around the time I was 8 or 9 on PBS about the life of Booker T. Washington. And my dad would just watch it like every weekend. So I memorized the movie, and at the beginning of the film, Booker T. Washington, he so desperately wants to learn how to read that he starts, sort of he's working for a white woman, he pulls a book off the shelf, he drops a vase, shatters all over the floor, she runs in, she wants to scream at him, but she sees a book in his hand, and her heart softens, and even though she's not supposed to be doing this, she starts teaching him how to read, and he reads his way through the local library, and that set him on the path to what he did. And so I remember, I wanted to read my way through the Ogden library. The librarian explained that probably wasn't going to happen, but I'd be able to read as much as I could. And so it was incredible to kind of have that experience and become, sort of a reader in that space and take in as much of the world as I could. And in the library, too, I began to get a sense of the kind of life that I wanted to lead after I left Utah. The biggest the craziest and biggest personal tragedy that happened in my life was when I was 13 and we moved away. We were living in Ogden at the time. My dad was trying to get a job and it just wasn't working out. And I think he was also lonely. He missed being around other immigrants, and there weren't many here. And so he decided to move to North Texas, where there is a sprawling Nigerian diaspora. And so we moved there in the mid-90s, and I just was completely unprepared for that experience because, first of all, they were listening to stuff on the radio. I know Utah's different now, but when I was a child, there wasn't a lot of I don't remember listening to a lot of pop music here. It was a very kind of cloistered upbringing. And Texas was different. People were out there, they were loud, they were cursing, they were doing all kinds of stuff that I just was sort of appalled by. I remember I was so nervous about the fact that I was going to be going into school, and I thought, I want to dress to impress. I need these people to know that I'm serious, that I'm here, that I know what I'm doing. My favorite shirt at the time was a Michael Jackson shirt. It had Michael Jackson's face big on the front, and it had 2 holes on the bottom, but I thought Michael Jackson's face is so incredibly compelling that people won't see the holes on the bottom of the shirt. And I wore some incredibly tight jeans, but I thought they like tight jeans in Texas. I don't know where I got this thing, but they'll like the way I'm dressed. And I walked into school, 7th grade. Middle school's hard, middle school's hard. Yeah. And I walked into the door, and somebody saw me, and he pointed at me and started laughing at the top of his lungs. He was laughing, and everybody kind of gathered. What's so funny? And I'm just standing there like, I guess I failed this assignment. And so, but basketball, I played basketball, and that sort of enabled me to get to know people there. But it was a weird place because I was in this moment when I was still thinking of myself as a Utahn, as somebody who sort of carried the values of this place and the way of being that I learned in this place, where I was in this, other place that was incredibly diverse, where, oftentimes in Utah, we had been the only Black person around. And now all of a sudden I was one of many. And I didn't know, as it were, how to be Black in this situation because I'd never learned those things. And so it was this incredibly sort of arduous path where I was trying to figure out how to be a Black person, but my parents were like, you're a Nigerian, so you have to be a Nigerian. And then, of course, I'm like in the back of that, I'm an American. My parents were incredibly patriotic. And around this time, my dad was becoming an American citizen. So he would often, he wanted to pass the citizenship test, and he would ask me, like, what's the preamble to the Constitution, which I'd memorized. So we talked about those things. And so that was also the backdrop. Like, I'm an American, I'm an African American, I'm a Nigerian. What am I? What am I supposed to be? And that's really what this book is about. It's about like somebody who's trying to figure out what he is and trying to kind of come up with an identity that matches what he feels inside. I think most of us, when we're born, we kind of get an identity card handed to us. You're born and your parents say, this is who you are. Your community says, this is who you are. And there's an agreement between the community and your family. And so that becomes a source of confidence for you. In my case, my parents handed me an identity card that said you're a Nigerian. My community handed me an identity card that said you're a Black person. And there was stuff happening within me that didn't agree with either of those realities. And so it became incredibly hard, I think, when I was younger to shape an identity that would enable me to kind of do well in the world. And that was the enduring struggle for me for a very long time. So much so, in fact, that after I spent time in Texas, my dad had insisted that we watch a show called A Different World, which was about Black college students in America, and I became besotted with these characters, and I figured out I'm going to go to Hillman, which was a college feature in the school. Hillman didn't exist, of course. I learned at Hillman that parts of A Different World were filmed on the campus of Morehouse and Spelman and Clark Atlanta. So I became obsessed with the idea of going to Morehouse College. Morehouse College, all males, predominantly Black school in Atlanta, Georgia, that features like a murderous row of graduates, including Martin Luther King Jr., Sam Jackson, all kinds of like incredible luminaries have gone there. And so I went there because I thought, I'll figure things out. I'm going to go to Morehouse. I'm going to be around other driven, ambitious, smart Black men. I will leave there with a solid sense of who I am. I went to Morehouse, and I learned that a lot of people there came from generations of people who had gone to that school. They're from very wealthy families who had excelled in America, and they were continuing the tradition by sending their progeny to Morehouse. And I didn't emerge from that at all. And so there was some initial friction in the beginning, and this class dimension was added to this kind of identity struggle that I was having. It was in college that I said, well, my identity is that I'm a nerd, I'm an academic. That's what I'm gonna do. I'll work hard at class, I'll be as driven as possible, and I'll get a good job, and that'll be the thing. And so that's what I did for a while. I spent some time at Morehouse. I spent a year at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. I spent a semester at the University of Cape Town, again, just kind of chasing some idea of who I could be. Ended up back at Morehouse. My senior year at Morehouse, I came in, because I traveled so much, they took away a portion of my scholarship. And so I was homeless my senior year, and I was just utterly sort of shocked and scared by this. And I thought, if I don't manage to make it out of college, it's going to be over for me because my parents can't help me. I was sending them money every month. I had no idea what would happen. I was living on my friend's couch, and he had just informed me that I have to go somewhere else because I've been on the couch for a week and I hadn't paid anything. He's like, I can't sustain this anymore. My roommates could get bad. And so I was watching a movie called Malcolm X on the television, and I was watching it, and I was at the halfway point. And at the end of the film, there's a kind of roll call of African Americans who helped to fund that film because Spike Lee had a hard time getting financing from Hollywood. And as I was watching this roll call of like prominent African Americans, now I'm watching the film probably a decade after it's come out, I thought, what if I write every person here and I explain my predicament? Maybe somebody will help me. Maybe somebody, and this is how desperate I was. I was like, this is a good plan. So I went to the library and I wrote a bunch of letters. I wrote Magic Johnson. I wrote all kinds of people. Whitney Houston, I think, was there. Jack. I wrote everybody. All kinds of people. And I just thought, well, we'll see what happens. I wanted to apply for a Rhodes Scholarship, and Morehouse had informed me that I wouldn't be able to apply since I wasn't registered at the school. So for 2 weeks, I was just kind of going from place to place. I got an urgent call from the administrative office 2 weeks after I sent out the last of my letters. They called me in and they said, we just got this news that Oprah Winfrey's paid for your senior year of college. So she paid for my senior year. And at that juncture, it was like everything shifted for me because not only was I back in school, but I had a sense that there were people out there who cared about whether I survived or not. And so promptly Morehouse said, well, yes, we'll endorse your application for the Rhodes Scholarship. And I was fortunate enough to win. And after I won, Oprah reached out and said, I'd like to have dinner with you. I'll be in town in Atlanta in February. And so we ended up having dinner. And so I was now in a place where I thought, these kinds of things don't happen to me. What's going on here? I was sort of was kind of freaked out by it, I suppose. And so I ended up going to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And I thought, well, I'm going to do the thing that my parents want me to do, which is go to law school after this experience and then become an attorney and make a bunch of money and, so the only thing that Nigerian parents live for, and I think this applies to all Indian parents, is they want to brag to their friends about how their kids are doing. That's all they care about. They want to say, oh, my son is at Yale, what's your son doing? And so I knew I needed to give my dad something like that he could sort of use with his friends and his colleagues. And so I ended up getting a job at Google, and I worked there for a couple of years. I was based in London, but I spent most of my time